"Get your filthy hands off my garden." Earl's voice, sharp as a branch snapping underfoot, cracked through the quiet morning. Deputy Richard Callahan towered over him, one boot grinding into a bed of marigolds, the badge on his chest gleaming like a weapon. Earl's gnarled hands shook not from fear, but from decades of swallowing the same bitter poison. Just steps away, Marcus froze mid-run, his eyes locking on the scene. "Back away from my grandfather," he said, his voice low and full of a dangerous intent. But none of them knew that the next 60 seconds would turn this peaceful backyard into a battleground the whole world would talk about. If you feel this injustice, like and comment, let your voice be heard. The morning sun spilled across the small backyard in Savannah, Georgia, washing the air in a warm golden glow. Earl Thompson, 78 years old and steady as the old oak that shaded his garden, knelt among the rows of marigolds and tomatoes. Gardening was more than a pastime for him. It was his way of keeping time with the seasons, of grounding himself in something pure and alive. The scrape of his trowel against the soil was steady, deliberate, the same way he taught his late wife to plant roses when they were first married. Around him the world felt still. Birds chattered in the branches above, the scent of fresh earth rose from the ground, and the distant hum of traffic felt like a faraway song. However, peace is a fragile thing, especially when prejudice walks through the gate. The sudden slam of a car door sliced through the quiet. Earl straightened slowly, his knees stiff from years of labor, and saw a man in a khaki sheriff's uniform striding toward him. Deputy Richard Callahan was a man the neighborhood knew, though not for kindness. His reputation was whispered about over porch railings. Quick to judge, quicker to act, and slow to question his own certainty. Today his jaw was set, eyes narrowed as if the garden itself had committed a crime. Rick didn't start with a greeting. He barked out, "We've had complaints about noise and trespassing." The words landed like stones. Earl blinked, glancing at a small plot hemmed in by a picket fence, no louder than the breeze. "This is my property," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who has been questioned before, too many times for simply existing where he belonged. For those unfamiliar, this is what racial profiling feels like. It's not always about shouted slurs. Sometimes it's the unshakable assumption that you do not belong, even in your own home. Outside the fence, a few neighbors paused mid-step. Mrs. Clean, who lived 2 doors down, clutched her grocery bag and lingered, her eyes darting between Earl and the uniformed man. A boy on a bicycle slowed to a stop, curiosity flickering across his face. It's human nature to notice tension. People may not step in yet, but they feel the shift in the air. Rick stepped closer, the toes of his boots grinding into the edge of Earl's flower bed. Without asking, he kicked aside a small clay pot. Soil spilled onto the grass like an unspoken threat. Earl's hand tightened around the handle of his trowel, not as a weapon but as something to steady him. "You've got no business talking to me this way," he said, his voice low but firm. The problem with bullies, especially those in positions of authority, is that they often mistake calmness for weakness. At that moment, on the sidewalk half a block away, Marcus Thompson was jogging home from his morning run. The 25-year-old moved with an easy stride, sweat cooling on his skin, music pulsing faintly from the earbuds slung around his neck. He spotted his grandfather's figure in the garden and slowed, smiling automatically. But as he drew closer, his smile faded. The body language was wrong. Earl's shoulders were squared, his head slightly back, while the deputy loomed over him like a storm cloud. Marcus removed his earbuds and quickened his pace. "Everything okay here?" he called, but his voice was swallowed by the rising tension. Rick turned, eyes hardening at the sight of the younger man. "This is official business. Move along," he ordered. Marcus didn't move. It's a simple fact. When family is involved, the instinct to protect overrides almost everything else, even the urge to avoid trouble. The air thickened as if the garden itself was holding its breath. Rick ignored the grandson and bent down toward Earl, muttering something too low for others to hear, but the tone was sharp enough to cut. Earl's face tightened. The past is a long shadow. Marcus had heard the stories from his grandfather's youth, the indignities endured in another era. Now, seeing this scene unfold in broad daylight, he felt those stories come alive in the worst way. Outside the gate, the neighbors exchanged glances. A woman across the street quietly pulled out her phone, pressing record. That's the modern witness. People who might hesitate to step in physically, but know the power of having evidence. It's a sad truth that without it, the most vulnerable voices often go unheard. Rick's foot nudged another flower pot, tipping it over. This whole setup, he said with a sneer, probably not even yours. Earl exhaled slowly, his dignity intact, though each word from the deputy seemed to chip at it. Marcus's hands curled into fists, but he forced himself to keep them at his sides. Back away from my grandfather, he said, steady but loud enough for everyone to hear. His voice carried not just authority but warning. The deputy glanced around, perhaps realizing eyes were on him now. So he didn't step back. Instead he took one more step into the garden, the space between him and Earl shrinking to nothing. And in that moment the quiet morning Earl had built for himself, one of sun, soil and patient growth, was gone, replaced by something raw, volatile and uncertain. Outside the gate, Marcus moved closer, his presence a silent promise that the balance of power was about to shift, whether the deputy realized it yet or not. The air between Earl Thompson and Deputy Richard Callahan felt sharp enough to cut. Rick's voice, low but edged with malice, carried accusations that had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with contempt. His words were not shouted, but their weight pressed down like heavy stones. Men like you don't belong in neighborhoods like this, he said, glancing at the small, neatly kept home beyond the garden. It was a sentence dressed as observation, but it carried the sting of an insult meant to remind Earl of some imagined line he had crossed. This is how prejudice often hides in plain sight, not in the roar of open hatred, but in the calm delivery of a lie intended to diminish. Earl's lips pressed together. He knew this tone. It was the same one used decades ago by shopkeepers who followed him around stores, assuming his presence meant trouble. The same one from landlords who told him a property had just been rented after seeing the color of his skin. He had lived through the worst of it, and yet standing here in his own yard he felt the old frustration rise again. His hands gripped the handles of his gardening shears, not out of threat, but to keep them from trembling. Marcus stood a few feet away, his muscles tight as if bracing for a blow. He spoke evenly, but there was a steeliness in his voice. Deputy, you've made your point. Step back. Rick's eyes flicked toward him, then back to Earl as if the younger man's words were no more than background noise. This, too, is part of the dynamic. Ignoring those who challenge you because to acknowledge them is to admit they have a place in the conversation. The tension pulled in the neighbors who had stopped to watch. Mrs. Clean now stood fully still, her grocery bag resting against her leg. Across the street, a young mother with a stroller whispered something to an older man beside her. The boy on the bicycle stayed put, his eyes wide. People sense when a situation has moved beyond the ordinary. This was no longer a routine conversation if it had ever been one. Rick stepped closer again, crowding Earl's space. You think because you've been here a while it's yours. Property changes hands all the time. His words slid between them, an attempt to rewrite reality. Earl's garden had been his for decades. He turned the soil himself, built the raised beds with his own hands. But in Rick's mouth, the truth was a thing to be bent, reshaped, and used as a weapon. However, what Rick didn't account for was the quiet strength in Earl's demeanor. This land was paid for, worked on, and cared for by me, Earl said evenly. The only thing changing hands today is your attitude if you don't step back. The line landed softly but with a firmness that made the neighbors lean in. A strong response doesn't always require shouting. Sometimes the most cutting replies are those that remain calm because they force the aggressor to hear every word clearly. Rick's lips curled into a smirk. Careful. Talking like that could make your situation worse. The implication was clear. An abuse of authority cloaked in casual speech. Marcus took a step forward, placing himself just enough in Rick's line of sight to draw attention. Or maybe, Marcus said, it's already as bad as it's going to get and you just haven't realized it. The air seemed to tighten, the kind of silence that precedes either retreat or escalation. Outside the garden, the woman with the phone adjusted her grip, making sure the camera had both men in frame. Recording might seem passive, but in moments like this, it becomes an act of quiet resistance, a safeguard that says, we will not let this vanish without proof. Earl noticed her but kept his focus on the man in front of him. He'd learned long ago that letting someone see they'd gotten under your skin only gave them more power. Rick began circling slowly, eyes darting between Earl and Marcus. You one of those families who think they can push back just because the news is on your side these days. His words were meant to sting, to provoke. He spoke as if current conversations about justice and equality were nothing more than trends, ignoring the generations of pain that had led to them. For people like Rick, acknowledgement of injustice feels like a threat to their own standing. Marcus's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of his grandfather's history pressing into this moment. He thought of the times Earl had told him about standing his ground, not with fists but with presence, with the refusal to be erased. However, he also knew the danger that came with challenging a man in uniform. The balance between dignity and safety was a fine one, and in moments like this, it was a line drawn in shifting sand. Earl's eyes never wavered. "I've seen your kind before," he said, voice steady. "Men who think a badge makes them bigger than decency. But here's the truth, it doesn't. It only makes it easier to see who you really are." For a second, even Rick's smirk faltered. Words like these are not meant to win an argument. They're meant to hold a mirror up to the person standing there, forcing them to see the reflection they've been avoiding. The neighbors felt it too. The weight of the exchange, the way each sentence layered on the next. This was no longer just about a garden or even about the two men in it. It was about the larger pattern of moments like this, repeated in countless places where authority meets prejudice and decides to flex its power. The difference here was that Earl was not alone, and the presence of witnesses, of Marcus, shifted the balance just enough to keep the worst from happening, at least for now. Finally, Rick leaned back slightly, though his glare didn't soften. "You think you're untouchable because people are watching?" he asked. Earl didn't answer. Sometimes silence is the sharpest reply because it leaves the other person struggling to fill it. Marcus took another step closer, close enough that the space between him and Rick felt like a silent challenge. The deputy's eyes darted to the phone, still recording from the sidewalk, then back to Marcus, and something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't over, not yet. But the words had been exchanged, and in their own way, they'd already cut deeper than any weapon could. The afternoon sun had climbed higher, baking the garden and drawing sharp shadows between the rows of flowers and vegetables. The air was heavy not just with heat, but with the weight of a standoff that had stretched too long. Earl Thompson stood rooted near his workbench, his face calm, but his grip on the edge of the table steadying him. Marcus, his grandson, was a few steps ahead, his posture taut, every muscle in his frame braced for what might come next. Across from them, Deputy Richard Callahan lingered in the garden like an uninvited storm cloud, his gaze hard and unrelenting. It felt as though time had slowed, each breath a measured count toward an outcome neither side was willing to name aloud. However, the stillness cracked when Rick's hand shifted toward his utility belt. The movement was slow, deliberate, but it carried the unspoken language of threat. His fingers brushed the baton hanging there, and the sight made Marcus' pulse quicken. In moments like this, action is often measured not by what's done, but by what's implied. A baton in an officer's hand can be a tool for control, but in the wrong hands or the wrong heart, it becomes a weapon of intimidation. Earl's eyes flicked to the baton and then back to Rick's face. "There's no need for that," he said, his voice even, almost gentle. But Rick didn't reply. Instead, he took a step forward, his boots crushing the damp soil, the sound loud in the otherwise quiet yard. The neighbors watching from the fence line seemed to lean in unconsciously, sensing that whatever happened next would tip the balance. Marcus moved instinctively, stepping between his grandfather and the deputy. His stance was protective but not aggressive. His arms slightly out to his sides as though he could shield Earl with nothing but his presence. "That's close enough," he said firmly. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, it wasn't clear whether Rick would back off or press forward. Outside the garden, someone muttered, "He's really going to do it." The woman with the phone adjusted her angle, making sure to capture both men. There is a certain gravity in knowing you are being watched. Some see it as a constraint, others as a challenge. Rick seemed to fall into the latter category. Instead of retreating, he swung his boot into the side of Earl's gardening basket, sending its contents spilling across the ground. A trowel skittered into the grass, a coil of twine unraveled, and a sturdy garden shovel clattered against the edge of the workbench. The sound rang out, metallic and final like the clang of a starting bell. Earl's breath caught and he bent slightly as if to retrieve the scattered tools. Rick stepped forward again, and this time his hand closed around the baton. "Sometimes," he said coldly, "people only learn when you make the lesson clear." The statement was more than arrogance. It was a promise of harm. Marcus's heart pounded in his ears. He could feel the air narrowing around them, the space for dialogue shrinking until only action remained. He remembered his grandfather's words from years before. Violence isn't the answer unless it's the only answer left. Back then it had been a lesson about self-defense in a dangerous neighborhood. Today it was the line between standing down and standing up. Rick raised the baton slightly, testing the weight in his hand. "Last chance," he said, though his tone made it clear he had no intention of waiting for a response. The baton's shadow fell across Earl's shoulder. Marcus took a step closer, his voice low but carrying, "You need to walk away now." But Rick ignored him, eyes fixed on Earl like a predator sizing up prey. The tension was no longer something abstract. It had a pulse, a rhythm, and it was moving toward a single beat. At the fence, the boy on the bicycle whispered to Mrs. Clean, "Why isn't someone stopping him?" She shook her head, eyes locked on the scene. It's a difficult truth, but moments like these often paralyze bystanders. They fear making things worse, yet they can't turn away. Rick's arm lifted, the baton rising above his shoulder. Earl's gaze was steady, his back straight, but Marcus could see the slight tremor in his hands. It was enough. Marcus's eyes darted to the shovel lying a foot away, its handle streaked with fresh soil. He didn't think. Thinking was for people with time. He reached down, fingers curling around the wooden grip, feeling the weight settle in his palm. The moment stretched thin the way it does before a lightning strike. Rick's baton began to swing downward. Marcus stepped forward, the shovel coming up between them, intercepting the arc of the baton with a sharp, resonant crack. The force of the block reverberated through his arms, but he held his ground. For a fraction of a second there was silence. Pure, unbroken shock. Then voices rose from the fence line, urgent and overlapping. "It's on camera," someone shouted. "Back off," another yelled. Rick's face flushed crimson, his grip on the baton tightening as if he might try again. But Marcus didn't lower the shovel. He stood his ground, breathing hard, eyes locked on the man who had threatened his grandfather. The shovel wasn't just a tool now. It was a line drawn in the dirt, a barrier that said, "No further." The deputy took a half step back, the crowd's shouts washing over him, his jaw clenched, and for the first time since he'd stepped into the garden, he looked uncertain. The authority he had worn like armor seemed to falter under the weight of witnesses, of defiance, of a moment that would not be erased or forgotten. Finally, Rick lowered the baton slightly, though his glare remained fixed on Marcus. "You'll regret that," he muttered, but the words carried less force than before. Marcus didn't reply. Some statements don't deserve answers, only action, and he had already delivered his. The breaking point had been reached, and though no one could say what would follow, the balance of power in that garden had shifted. The quiet dignity of an old man, the resolve of his grandson, and the watchful eyes of a community had turned a moment of potential harm into a stand for respect. The clash of metal on metal still rang in Marcus Thompson's ears as he stood between his grandfather and Deputy Richard Callahan. The shovel in his hands felt heavier now, not because of its weight but because of what it represented. A clear refusal to bow to intimidation. Rick's baton wavered in the air for a moment, but his eyes were still locked on Earl, as though Marcus were just an inconvenient obstacle rather than a barrier he couldn't cross. The crowd beyond the fence had grown. People leaned over railings, phones held high, voices murmuring in disbelief. The scene had taken on a strange energy. It was no longer just an argument in a garden. It was a public test of right versus wrong, power versus principle. However, Rick stepped forward again, the space between him and Marcus closing in. His expression was one of frustration. The kind that bubbles when someone used to winning realizes the tide might be turning. "Put it down," he barked, his voice sharp. But Marcus didn't move. He tightened his grip on the shovel's handle, feeling the coarse grain of the wood beneath his fingers. This was no longer just about protecting Earl's flowers or his backyard. This was about protecting the man himself, his dignity, his safety, his right to stand in his own space without fear. Rick lunged suddenly, his shoulder angled as if to shove Marcus aside. The movement was fast, but so was Marcus. He sidestepped, the shovel coming up in a smooth arc. This wasn't a wild swing. It was controlled, precise, the way a carpenter might lift a hammer to drive in a single necessary nail. The edge of the shovel's blade caught Rick across the side of the head, not enough to break bone, but enough to knock him off balance and send him sprawling backward into the soft, damp earth. The thud of his body hitting the ground was followed by a collective gasp from the onlookers. For a moment no one moved. The sound of bird song returned faintly as if the world itself had been holding its breath. Rick lay on his back, blinking in surprise, his baton a few feet away where it had rolled in the dirt. The humiliation was plain on his face. But so was the realization that he was no longer in control of the situation. In life, power often shifts in moments like this. Not gradually but in a single, unmistakable instant. Outside the fence someone called out, "We've got it all on video." Another voice added, "You can't get away with this." The words were more than taunts. They were reminders that accountability was no longer a private matter. In an age where evidence can travel the world in seconds, those who abuse their authority can no longer count on silence to protect them. Earl stepped forward then, his hands trembling but his voice steady. "That's enough," he said, not to Marcus but to Rick. "You came here looking for trouble and you found the wrong place for it." There was no anger in his tone, only a kind of weary truth. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a line drawn and defended. Rick tried to sit up, but Marcus was already there, planting the shovel's blade into the ground beside him, leaning on it just enough to remind the deputy he was still standing over him. "Leave my grandfather alone," Marcus said, his voice low but resonant. "You've done enough." The words were less a request than a final verdict. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder until two more patrol cars pulled up to the curb. Officers stepped out, scanning the scene with weary eyes. It took only a glance at the crowd of witnesses and the cell phones pointed their way to grasp that something had gone wrong, and that it was their colleague in the center of it. One officer knelt beside Rick, speaking in a low tone, while another began asking questions of the nearest bystanders. The responses came fast and certain. He shoved the old man first. "We saw the whole thing. It's all on video." Each statement layered over the next, building a picture that no amount of official denial could paint over. The officers listened, glancing between the crowd and Rick, who was now sitting up, his jaw clenched. Finally, the senior officer turned to Rick. "You need to come with us." The words were flat, procedural, but their meaning was clear. Rick hesitated, his pride warring with the inevitability of the moment. In the end he stood, brushing soil from his uniform, and allowed himself to be led toward the waiting car. The murmurs from the crowd swelled into something like applause, not for violence, but for the rare sight of accountability arriving in real time. Marcus exhaled slowly, the tension draining from his shoulders. He set the shovel down gently on the workbench as if returning it to its rightful place. Earl placed a hand on his grandson's arm, the gesture saying what words couldn't. In the garden, the marigolds swayed in the light breeze, their petals untouched by the chaos that had unfolded around them. Justice had not come from a courtroom or a long investigation. It had come in one swing, a moment of courage born from love and necessity. Outside the gate, the neighbors began to disperse, their conversations buzzing with what they'd witnessed. Marcus knew this story would spread, perhaps far beyond Savannah. But in his mind, the only thing that mattered was that Earl was safe and standing beside him. The day's peace had been broken, but in its place, something else had taken root. A reminder that sometimes when injustice comes knocking, the answer is not to open the door, but to stand in front of it, unyielding. A week later, the garden looked much as it had before that tense afternoon. Fresh rows of marigolds, a neatly trimmed border of hedges, and the soft hum of bees drifting from bloom to bloom. Earl Thompson moved slowly along the path, his knees still protesting after too many hours of bending and planting. Yet there was something lighter in his step. The bruises of that day had faded, but the memory remained not as a wound, but as a reminder of what it meant to stand one's ground. Marcus was there too, kneeling in the corner by the fence, planting a new rose bush. The rich scent of the soil filled the air as he worked, glancing occasionally at his grandfather. "I figured this spot could use a bit more color," he said, patting the earth around the base of the plant. Earl nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't just about flowers. It was about putting something back where something had been taken, about choosing to grow instead of letting damage define the space. However, the events of that day had reached beyond the garden's fence. In the days following, the videos taken by neighbors had spread quickly, first through the community, then across state lines. Strangers sent messages of support. People shared their own stories, moments when they had faced injustice and either found the courage to resist or wish they had. This was the unexpected ripple effect of one act of defense. It reminded others that their own dignity was worth protecting. In response, the neighborhood organized a community meeting at the local church. The room was full. Neighbors, activists, church leaders, even a few city officials who had heard about the incident. Earl spoke first, standing at the front of the hall. His voice was calm, his words deliberate. He did not recount every detail of the confrontation. Instead, he spoke about the importance of respect, how it was as necessary to a healthy community as clean water or good soil. Dignity, he told them, is not a thing you give away. And when someone tries to take it from you, you have a right to hold on. Marcus spoke too, sharing what it felt like to step in, to take action even when every part of you knows it could go wrong. It's not about looking for a fight, he said. It's about knowing there's a moment when you can't just watch anymore. Sometimes that moment comes for you. Sometimes it comes for someone you love. His words drew nods from people around the room, some with eyes bright from their own memories. Outside of these gatherings, the garden became something of a symbol. Neighbors would stop by more often, sometimes to check in, sometimes just to share a story or offer a hand with the planting. What had once been a quiet, private space now carried a sense of shared ownership, not in the legal sense, but in the way people rally around a place that means something to their collective story. Earl, for his part, didn't seek recognition. He went back to his routines, rising early, tending the soil, greeting passers-by with a wave. But there was an unspoken understanding between him and Marcus now. A bond strengthened by the knowledge that they had faced something hard together and come through it with their heads high. Besides the personal victory, there was also a broader lesson that lingered in the air. Courage isn't always about grand gestures or public stands. Sometimes it's about small moments. Choosing to speak when it's easier to stay quiet. Choosing to protect when it's easier to turn away. And dignity, once defended, has a way of inspiring others to do the same. Finally, as the sun began to set one evening, Marcus and Earl stood side by side, looking over the garden. The rose bush Marcus had planted was already taking root, its leaves catching the last light of the day. "This will outlast us," Marcus said softly. Earl nodded. "That's the point." In that moment the quiet returned. Not the fragile peace that could be broken by a slammed car door, but a stronger kind, built on the knowledge that they had faced injustice together and refused to yield. It was a reminder for anyone who passed by that some things are worth defending, and when you do they can grow into something lasting. The garden in Savannah stood quiet again, bathed in the golden warmth of a late afternoon sun. Earl Thompson's marigolds swayed gently in the breeze, the same marigolds that had been trampled in anger just days before. The soil had been turned, replanted and cared for. Yet the real change wasn't in the garden itself. It was in the people who had witnessed what happened here, in the bond between a grandfather and grandson that had been tested and proven unbreakable, and in the undeniable truth that justice can sometimes bloom in the most unexpected places. From the moment Deputy Richard Callahan stepped into that yard, it was never just about flowers or property lines. It was about power, dignity, and the refusal to be pushed aside. Earl had stood in that garden for years, tending to life and beauty in a world that often tried to take them from him. On that day he stood for something more. The right to be respected, to exist without having to explain or defend his place. Marcus, arriving in that crucial moment, embodied the other side of the same fight. Love in action. The instinct to protect those who matter most, even when the odds are unclear and the risks are real. The confrontation escalated with words meant to wound, with boots grinding into earth meant for growth, and with a weapon lifted not in defense but in threat. But then came the breaking point. A moment where hesitation would have meant loss and action became the only option. Marcus's swing of the shovel was not about vengeance. It was about drawing a line that would not be crossed. It was swift, decisive, and carried the weight of generations who had been told to step aside. In the aftermath, the community stood witness. Phones recorded, voices rose, and the truth became harder to deny. What could have been buried under silence instead became a story that traveled far beyond the garden fence. It showed that even in small corners of the world, moments of courage can ripple outward, inspiring others to stand firm in their own battles. However, the real victory was not in the deputy's removal from the garden or the applause from onlookers. It was in the quiet moments that followed. Earl returned to his planting. Marcus returned to his runs. The garden returned to its rhythm. But both men carried forward the knowledge that they had faced down injustice together and had not let it take root. That's the kind of strength that doesn't fade. It grows like the marigolds, season after season. The lesson here is both simple and profound. Dignity is not given. It's upheld. No matter your age, status, or position, you have the right to stand firm when someone tries to take it from you. Courage isn't about looking for conflict. It's about recognizing the moments when silence would mean surrender. Sometimes it's a public act with cameras rolling and neighbors watching. Other times it's a private choice, one no one else will see. But the principle is the same. You protect what matters and you do it without hesitation. In today's world, where injustice can unfold anywhere from a quiet garden to a crowded street, we can all take something from Earl and Marcus' story. We can choose to be watchful, to speak when it counts, to protect without waiting for someone else to step in. We can build communities where respect isn't optional, where people look out for one another the way Marcus looked out for his grandfather. And when we do, we make it that much harder for prejudice and abuse to find fertile ground. If you followed this story from beginning to end, you felt the tension, the injustice, and the resolve that turned the tide. Let it remind you that your voice matters, your actions matter, and that standing up for what's right is never wasted. This garden was defended with one swing, but it was also defended with years of love, care, and quiet determination. That's the kind of foundation we should all be building in our own lives. If this story has moved you, inspired you, or made you think about the power of standing up for what's right, then I invite you to be part of this journey. Subscribe to the channel so we can keep sharing stories that matter. Stories that shine a light on courage, dignity, and the everyday heroes among us. Your support helps us keep going, and together we can keep planting seeds of change.